Release the Epstein Files. No, wait, Epstein is actually a host. No, wait, since everyone is spending a ridiculous amount of time on this, I don't know why, just release all the grand jury testimony, even though that's not what people are asking for, and you can't do it without court permission, and the court will probably block that.
The amount of flip-flopping that has gone on with this issue with Trump and Epstein is unbelievable. It's crazy. He created this problem for himself, and now it's a Democratic hoax, a hoax by Democrats, created by Democrats. It makes no sense. I mean, he just release what you have. Just release what you have. I don't
Trump's
get it.
"I'm not involved with Jeffrey Epstein" t-shirt has a lot of people asking questions already answered by his t-shirt. And the funny thing about that meme is that it was originally literally about human trafficking. But the long and short of it is that the MAGA movement may have finally taken a stand against the Trump administration.
The current DOJ under Pam Bondi is covering up crimes.
But back in 2024, candidate Trump made some promises about releasing these so-called Epstein Files.
Would you declassify the Epstein
files.
Files?
Yeah, I would.
During his most
And the
recent
JFK
presidential campaign,
files.
Trump said that he would have, quote, no problem looking into the Epstein client list.
The list of clients that went to the island has not been made public.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? But yeah, I'd be inclined to do the Epstein. I'd have no problem with it.
Then Attorney General Pam Bondi told everyone that
Bullshit.
Epstein's legendary client list was right there on her desk. Except it wasn't. Pam Bondi released a 2-page memo saying that actually Epstein did just kill himself. There's no secret client list, and there are no more documents that are going to be released.
How
And everyone
convenient.
believed her, and that was the end of the story. No, I'm just kidding. Trump supporters weren't having it at all. Even Trump's reliable
This is what's crazy. Even huge MAGA Trump supporters, even they're not taking the bait. They're calling bullshit, as they should. I mean, like I said, Trump created this issue, and he was the one that hyped it up to get his supporters out to vote for him, and now they're pissed.
buddies over at Fox
Understandably.
News aren't buying the narrative.
Why do you say he's become the deep state?
What is more deep state than covering up for pedophiles?
And Trump took to Truth Social to post a long screed proclaiming how great Bondi is and telling everyone to, quote, not waste time and energy on Jeffrey Epstein, somebody that nobody cares about. Except that a whole bunch of people care a whole lot about Epstein.
Make some noise if you care about the Jeffrey Epstein scandal.
Raise your hand if it matters a lot to you. Raise your hand. So every hand of 7,000 people.
And now we live in a world where Congress's resident Jewish space laser enthusiast Marjorie
I don't see Charlie Kirk criticizing Trump, by the way.
Taylor Greene and Silicon Valley progressive Ro Khanna might finally agree on something. And meanwhile, while all this was playing out in the media, the Trump Department of Justice finally acted on Ghislaine Maxwell's plea for the Supreme Court to overturn her conviction after months of delay. Oh, and now Donald Trump is threatening to sue, quote, the ass off of Rupert Murdoch. He's furious because the Wall Street Journal published a story last night about Trump sending Jeffrey Epstein a handwritten birthday card in 2003 where Trump hand drew sketches of a naked woman and then made his signature mimic pubic hair, and which Trump ends the letter with, quote, happy birthday and may every day be another wonderful secret. So suffice to say, there is a lot going on here, both
Weird
in the
as fuck.
media, in the
Weird.
government, and in the courts. And a lot of suspicious timing with how the Trump administration is playing this, and baffling statements from Trump himself. So as the MAGA world implodes, let's take a step back and talk about how we got here, what the Epstein Files actually are, and what they are not. And make no mistake about it, apart from all of the fabricated conspiracy theories, the Epstein saga does point to an actual real-life conspiracy that spits in the face of anyone who cares about equal justice and the rule of law in this country. But from the very beginning, everything that touched Jeffrey Epstein reeked of corruption. In 1996, Maria Farmer, an artist in her mid-20s, reported to the NYPD and the FBI that Epstein and his associate, British socialite Ghislaine Maxwell, had violently sexually assaulted her while she was visiting his property in upstate New York. Farmer claims that she also warned the FBI that Epstein and Maxwell had committed multiple serious sex crimes against girls, including her minor sister, that Epstein stole nude and partially nude photos of 2 of her minor sisters, and that he possessed child pornography. But neither law enforcement agency followed up on Farmer's complaint. And nearly a decade later, in March of 2005, a woman reported to the Palm Beach police that her 14-year-old stepdaughter had been molested by a wealthy man. In subsequent police interviews, the girl confirmed that she had been recruited by a female classmate, also an undergrad, who had done sexual favors for Epstein in exchange for money. That classmate apparently took the 14-year-old complainant to Epstein's house, where his staff escorted her to his bedroom. Epstein appeared in nothing but a towel and told her to undress and then massage him, and during that massage, he sexually abused her. Now, the unnamed complainant came from a rough background. The underage classmate who recruited her had recently been sexually assaulted before she met Epstein, and this would become a pattern for Epstein. He preyed on girls from poor, violent, and troubled backgrounds, sexually abused them in exchange for money, and then paid them to recruit similarly troubled girls for him to abuse. Now, when Palm Beach detective Joe Ricari began conducting witness interviews, Epstein was quickly tipped off by one of the potential witnesses. Epstein then hired his own private investigators who sought out victims and witnesses often before they were even contacted by the police. Detective Ricari still managed to identify 17 victims, all in the 14 to 20 age range, all of which recounted a similar fact pattern of the original 14-year-old victim. Recruitment by another girl or woman, ostensibly to give Epstein massages in exchange for money, being told to undress, and then being sexually assaulted or groped, being paid for the massage and sexual interaction, and being offered compensation to find future victims. Now, based on the overwhelming testimony, Detective Ricari provided the state's attorney's office with probable cause affidavit drafts for felony sexual offenses for Epstein and 2 of his female recruiters. State's attorney Barry Kreischer, though, declined to talk to any victims or parents and decided that 17 witnesses just wasn't enough to make a case. So Kreischer offered Epstein a sweet plea deal. When Epstein rejected that, Kreischer made the highly unusual choice to take the matter to a grand jury. Typically, a state's attorney would simply charge and arrest the accused. But during the grand jury proceedings, the prosecutor, Lana Belahovlik, invited only 2 victims to testify before the grand jury, and it appears that Belahovlik actively undermined her own witnesses by peppering the girls with questions about unsavory social media posts and even accusing a 15-year-old victim of being a prostitute. Now, the state's attorney's office was also in close communication with Epstein's defense attorneys. And in fact, it was Epstein's attorneys who provided the prosecutors with the underage girls' questionable social media posts, which the prosecutors then used to bully their own underage witnesses. And in the end, the grand jury returned only a single charge, felony solicitation of prostitution, which said nothing about the girls being underage. Now, if you're infuriated by this, you're not the only one. Detective Ricari's boss, Palm Beach Police Chief Michael Reiter, one of the few good guys in this sordid story, was also furious enough at the state's attorney's actions that he sent a scathing letter to Kreischer stating, quote, "After giving this much thought and consideration, I must urge you to examine the unusual course that your office's handling of this matter has taken and consider if good and sufficient reason exists to require your disqualification from the prosecution of these cases."
Damn.
Detective Ricari also took the extraordinary step of going to the FBI to ask them to prosecute the case, since the state's attorney had done such a poor job. But the feds agreed to launch their own investigation. One can only speculate that this was because they already had a file on the guy from 1996 and probably wanted to save face, but we'll never know. But the FBI's reinvestigation turned up evidence of additional victims, including 34 confirmed minors. And the victims reported the same fact pattern of massages and sexual abuse. The feds found pictures of many of Epstein's victims in his house, as well as plenty of other corroborating evidence tying him to numerous underage victims. And armed with this mountain of evidence, the feds sharpened their lawyers' war axes and offered Epstein a slap-on-the-wrist plea deal that should have made national headlines as a travesty of justice.
I just don't understand.
But it did not. Now, back in 2007, we didn't have the tools we have today to get a bird's-eye view of how the Epstein slap on the wrist spread throughout the media and public sentiment. But when you use modern technology, you can see the massive political earthquake over Epstein in real time. We can see that there have been 372 stories about Epstein in the last 3 months, with 46% of the coverage coming from right-leaning sources, 24% coming from the center, and 30% coming from the left. And if you take a closer look at specific stories like the reporting from Wired that revealed editing in the security camera video of the night that Epstein died, you see a fascinating breakdown of how attitudes across political divides are rapidly changing. This story was only covered by about 50 sources, with 40% of the coverage coming from the right. On the left, sources mostly frame the missing footage as critical minutes that point to a larger cover-up and possible conspiracy. On the right, sources largely agreed with the left that the missing footage was critical, and were even more likely to embrace the yet unverified as of this recording claims that there exists even more missing footage. And in the center, sources typically focused on the problematic nature of the missing footage, but were not as likely to point to a cover-up. Now, headlines and coverage vary greatly depending on the source, which is why I use today's sponsor, Ground News. The Nobel Peace Center called Ground News an excellent way to stay informed, avoid echo chambers, and expand your worldview. They've been a longtime supporter of this channel and independent journalism at large. Because Ground News gathers related articles from around the world and across the political spectrum, so you can see the bias and compare coverage. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. Now, one of my favorite parts is their bias comparison feature, which highlights specific differences in reporting across the political spectrum. And I also love their blind spot feed, which shows you stories that are underreported by either side of the political spectrum. But all this is why Ground News is my favorite way to get the news. And as a legal eaglet, you can save 40% off the Ground News Vantage subscription by scanning the code on screen or clicking on the link down below. This subscription gives you unlimited access to every feature, including the Bias Insight tool and blind spot feed. So click now, or I will see you in court. But let's get back to 2007. when Jeffrey Epstein was offered the sweetheart plea bargain deal of the century. In June of 2007, the local U.S. Attorney's Office, under the leadership of Alex Acosta, issued a 53-page indictment against Epstein. Now, negotiations for a plea deal began with Epstein's all-star legal team. Ken Starr, famous for serving as independent counsel during the impeachment of Bill Clinton, Alan Dershowitz, famous for lots of stuff, and Jay Lefkowitz, a partner at Kirkland & Ellis, the same law firm where Acosta was previously a partner. And after a lot of cozy meetings with defense attorneys at hotels over breakfast, Acosta offered Epstein a remarkable deal. Epstein could plead guilty to state charges, 1 count of solicitation of prostitution and 1 count of solicitation of prostitution with a minor under the age of 18. He would be sentenced to 8 months in jail following a year of house arrest and be adjudicated as a convicted sex offender who must register twice a year in Florida. And that was it. That was the penalty for sexually abusing at least 34 underage girls in a systematic, calculating way for years. And even then, Epstein only spent his evenings in Florida jail. During the day, he was permitted work release at his swanky office building. Now, Acosta's deal with Epstein included several other gifts fit for a king of Wall Street. An agreement that the victims would not be notified, a promise that the deal would be kept under seal, and an agreement to dismiss all grand jury subpoenas. And Epstein's all-star legal team also managed to secure one more extraordinary victory: a non-prosecution agreement which allowed Epstein and his co-conspirators to avoid federal sex trafficking charges. Now, we've covered this before, but this plea deal was extraordinary for several reasons. First, 18 U.S.C. 3771, the Crime Victims' Rights Act, gives victims the right to be apprised of the developments in criminal proceedings, the right to be present at public proceedings, and the right to be heard related to plea deals, sentencing, and other key developments. Now, the prosecutors not only bypassed any notification of the victims, but they actively lied to the victims, sending them a letter months after the plea deal had already been signed, urging patience while the prosecution, quote, conducts a thorough investigation. Now, bypassing this law at the request of a serial sex abuser's attorneys was an extraordinary move by Acosta's part. Now, second, Acosta's agreement with Epstein not only prevented future prosecutions of Epstein, but also future prosecutions of his 4 named co-conspirators in an open-ended category of, quote, any potential co-conspirators. Another extraordinary gift. Now, both of these aspects of the agreement are legally important, but we'll get to that.
I just don't understand. What is Acosta doing? Why protect this guy? Why give him these gifts? Fuck him. Who cares? I know these people are connected and wealthy, but I just don't get it.
In a second. Now, the Miami
I don't
Herald
get what everyone's
blew the
gaining
lid off of this
trying to
entire
protect
story
this guy.
and reported that the plea deal may have been affected by Epstein's role as a witness in the 2008 securities fraud case against Bear Stearns executives. Now, ironically, those executives were later acquitted, along with pretty much anyone else who played a direct role in blowing up our economy. Now, we don't know for sure, but it looks like prosecutors threw a couple dozen underage girls under the bus in order to get some ineffective testimony about the cheating finance execs who tanked the world economy. So, Jeffrey Epstein served 13 months of nighttime imprisonment, spent his days at his swanky office, and apparently even continued to have women flown out to Palm Beach to have sex with him in exchange for money. And a few potential violations of the house arrest were documented in the state's attorney's files, but no one took action. And after his 13 months were up, Epstein seemed to return to his ordinary life of sexual predation. And faced with some additional law enforcement scrutiny, he purchased 2 private islands off the coast of the U.S. Virgin Islands in 2010 and 2016, respectively, where he then had even more leverage over his victims. In a later lawsuit, one of his victims revealed that in an act of desperation, she tried to swim off the island to escape him. But Epstein and his co-conspirators located her and then took her passport in an attempt to keep her captive. Another victim alleged that when she tried to escape the private island, Epstein and his co-conspirators returned her to his house and suggested physical restraint or harm if she failed to cooperate. And meanwhile, U.S. Attorney Alex Acosta went on to be appointed as Trump's Secretary of Labor.
On behalf of the President of the United States, it's my honor to welcome you all today to the office of the Vice President here at the White House complex for a very important moment in the life of this administration.
These people are just gross. You look at them and you know fucked up shit's going on behind the scenes.
Administration in our national life. As I administer the oath of office to the 27th Secretary of Labor for the United States of America, Alexander Acosta.
And all the bad guys lived happily ever after. Until two scrappy reporters, a few more heroes in the story, started looking into this. Julie K. Brown, an investigative reporter at the Miami Herald, and Miami Herald videographer Emily Michaud began investigating Epstein in early 2017, about the same time as Acosta was being nominated as Secretary of Labor by Donald Trump in his first term. And they uncovered 80 potential victims as young as 13 and 14 years old when the abuse occurred, and conducted video and written interviews with 8 survivors, the most important heroes in the story, who bravely agreed to tell their stories. And the Miami Herald's investigation ultimately led to Acosta's resignation from his Secretary of Labor role, and finally to a real criminal indictment against Jeffrey Epstein. So, on July 6, 2019, federal prosecutors in New York got a second chance to prosecute Epstein. And unlike Bill O'Reilly, you're probably smart enough to figure out that since this is 2019, this is still the Trump administration. Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, reportedly a hub of his sex trafficking network, and under 18 U.S.C. 1591, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York charged him with sex trafficking and sex trafficking conspiracy related to the abuse of dozens of minor girls at his properties in Palm Beach and New York. Now, the Southern District of New York's charges weren't double jeopardy because in Acosta's original case, Epstein only pled to state-level charges, and the 2019 indictment included only federal charges. Acosta's plea agreement with Epstein, though, would have likely become a thornier issue. But the U.S. attorneys never had to address that because on August 10, 2019, Epstein was found dead in his cell. A medical examiner's report ruled it a suicide by hanging. So obviously that ended the criminal prosecution against him, but it did not stop the legal fallout. Now, Maria Farmer and several other Epstein victims alleged the involvement of Epstein's longtime companion, Ghislaine Maxwell. Victims accused Maxwell of recruiting them, manipulating and gaslighting them by normalizing Epstein's predatory behavior, and even of sexually abusing them herself. And the Department of Justice's investigation corroborated this, finding that Maxwell and Epstein identified vulnerable girls, typically from single-mother households and difficult financial circumstances. Maxwell then helped Epstein entice and recruit the girls as young as 14 to visit Epstein's Palm Beach residence to be sexually abused by him. Maxwell also encouraged victims to travel to Epstein's other properties, knowing that they would be sexually abused there, and she helped pay victims for the sex acts and for recruiting other additional girls to be similarly abused by Epstein. And on December 29, 2021, Maxwell was found guilty of conspiracy to entice minors to travel to engage in illegal sex acts, conspiracy to transport minors to participate in illegal sex acts, transporting a minor to participate in illegal sex acts, sex trafficking conspiracy, and sex trafficking of a minor. Now,
I don't get what Ghislaine, whatever. I don't get what she's getting out of this deal, this relationship with Epstein. I mean, power, money, I guess, influence, but I just I mean, I don't get any of it, but I just don't know why is she involved.
Numerous powerful men and female co-conspirators have been named in connection with Epstein's sex crimes, but Maxwell remains the only person in the United States who was ever actually convicted of sex crimes related to the Epstein abuses. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison. But Maxwell may still evade justice thanks to Acosta's plea agreement with Epstein. In a 2023 appeal to the United States Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit, Maxwell argued that because Acosta's immunity deal with Epstein included an unnamed list of co-conspirators, and because Acosta didn't expressly limit the agreement to the Southern District of Florida, she should be included and should be immune. The DOJ has counter-argued that, quote, the phrase United States in a plea agreement like this is just a generic reference to the U.S. Attorney's Office that enters into the agreement and is not on its own enough to establish an affirmative appearance. The DOJ also argued that Maxwell has no right to invoke the protections of the agreement because she wasn't a signatory to the agreement and hadn't sufficiently argued its protections were conferred onto her. Now, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed Maxwell's conviction, but in April 2025, Maxwell filed a petition for writ of certiorari with the Supreme Court, asking the court to find that
refers to a Latin phrase, to be made certain, and it is commonly used when a party pleads to the Supreme Court to hear their case. And the Supreme Court, rarely grants it because they don't have the capacity to hear that many cases, so.
Acosta's sweetheart deal applied to her as well. Maxwell argued that there's a circuit split as to whether a promise on behalf of the United States or the government by a United States Attorney's Office in one district is binding upon offices in other districts. Now, confronted with this challenge, the Trump DOJ did nothing for 3 months, but mere days after Trump's meltdown on Truth Social, Trump's DOJ filed a conveniently timed response to Maxwell's petition for writ of certiorari, arguing that the plea deal did not apply to her. And the DOJ contended that, quote, at the time the NPA was negotiated, DOJ policy barred U.S. attorneys from entering into non-prosecution agreements that bound other districts unless they obtained the approval of those districts or the criminal division. And it would be strange if one rogue district attorney could bind the entire US government from ever filing charges against Epstein or his co-conspirators without ever consulting headquarters. But as of the recording of this video, the court hasn't decided whether it will hear Maxwell's case or not. And meanwhile, the many civil actions against Epstein's estate and associates continue. And for everyone out there hungry for names to be named, well, we have some good news. Thanks to how our justice system works, lots of names have been named in the civil cases. These are the true Epstein files, and we've gone through them, so you don't have to. One of the bravest and most vocal survivors was Virginia Roberts Giuffre. Giuffre was involved as a pseudonymous plaintiff in one of the first batch of civil lawsuits against Epstein in 2009. In 2011,
didn't she recently die? I mean, I
guess she revealed her identity as a survivor of abuse by Epstein and Maxwell. And she went on to file several lawsuits, including one against England's Prince Andrew for sexual abuse when she was 16 and 17, which resulted in an undisclosed settlement. In depositions and public statements, Giuffre has claimed many times that Maxwell recruited and groomed her for sexual abuse. Maxwell vehemently denied this and publicly called Giuffre a liar, and in response, Giuffre filed a defamation lawsuit against Maxwell. The case settled in 2017, but the case generated reams of documents, including depositions, pictures, communications, and a vast trove of other evidence.
Jesus.
These and other documentary evidence generated in other civil and criminal cases are the real Epstein files. And in early 2024, the court in Giuffre versus Maxwell ordered the unsealing of many of these documents. These documents had previously been sealed to protect the identities of many of Epstein's victims who still had not publicly identified themselves. Many of the documents contain not just names, but also identifying information about people's backgrounds, personal details that could have been used to re-identify victims. And court documents are often sealed in cases involving sexual abuse, especially the sexual abuse of minors, because the documents can contain exceptionally private and troubling details which, especially in a post-internet world, could affect the victim's safety. Indeed, in their depositions, several of Epstein's victims said that after their identities became public, they feared for their safety. But the documents in the Giuffre case were unsealed because there was an exceptionally strong public interest in the case and because Giuffre herself had argued that they should be unsealed. Maxwell's legal team argued vehemently against the unsealing of the documents, despite the fact that Maxwell had already been convicted years before. But this highlights a key tension in the case, the balance between the victim's need for privacy and the public's need to hold Epstein's co-conspirators accountable. And this tension is particularly strong in the Epstein case because many of the girls involved were not only victims themselves, but were also paid to recruit future victims. Even still, many...
And this is what makes it so difficult to go after these people. They get all these people involved, blackmail, pay them off, make it impossible or dangerous for them to speak out, and
redactions
never
were
go
applied
after them.
to protect the identities of victims who have still never publicly identified themselves and feared for their safety if they were named. And many prominent people were also named in the unsealed documents, but they had all been previously identified as Epstein associates. Giuffre's unsealed deposition detailed several times that Epstein directed her as a minor to have sex with prominent men, including Epstein's attorney, Alan Dershowitz, former Governor Bill Richardson, former Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell, CEO Les Wexner, Prince Andrew, MIT scientist Marvin Minsky, hotel company heir Thomas Pritzker, and billionaire Glenn Dubin. And all these men, except Minsky, who died in 2016 before Giuffre's allegations against him were public, had denied these charges, and none have been criminally charged. And the accusation against Dershowitz was particularly contentious. He and Giuffre both sued each other for defamation, agreeing in 2022 to settle their lawsuits against each other. And immediately after the settlement, Giuffre released a public statement saying that she, quote, may have made a mistake in identifying Mr. Dershowitz, but she later clarified that she, quote, did not and would never exonerate Mr. Dershowitz. The Giuffre's case was one of the many against Epstein and his associates. And companies tied to Epstein, including JP Morgan Chase, Deutsche Bank, and Barclays, have also been sued for turning a blind eye to obvious signs of human trafficking. And Epstein's estate has also paid out several $100 million in settlements to various parties, including victims and the government of the U.S. Virgin Islands. A voluntary victims compensation fund set up by Epstein's estate has paid out more than $120 million to 136 survivors of Epstein's sex trafficking network. And another 52 women filed and privately settled claims outside of the compensation fund. The documents and statements associated with these lawsuits, though, have revealed a plethora of additional information about Epstein and his sex trafficking patterns. One important pattern is that Epstein also often dangled not only money, but his social connections in order to lure his victims into his orbit. And Epstein was quite wealthy and very well connected to CEOs like Les Wexner of Victoria's Secret parent company, L Brands, to politicians like Bill Clinton and Donald Trump, to arts patrons like Eileen Guggenheim, to universities like Harvard and MIT, and even to scientists like Stephen Hawking. And to be clear, many, if not the vast majority of these people, were never involved in Epstein's trafficking operation.
Stephen Hawking, that one is always just wild to me. I don't know
part
how
of his
that
ability
works.
to evade capture and his ability to manipulate his victims was based on his long list of powerful friends and acquaintances. To Maria Farmer, he offered an introduction into the art world. To other girls, he offered help with their modeling careers, and to some, he offered help to further their education. And it's reasonable to conclude that Epstein's ability to evade accountability in 2006 was probably due to his wealth and connections. He was able to leverage those resources to hire the best attorneys, who in turn had connections to the prosecutors' offices. But MAGA and QAnon conspiracy theorists took those actual facts and blew them into fantastical conspiracy theories, which President Trump and his allies often encouraged. And last week, that practice of fanning the flames of conspiracy theories and making fantastical promises came back and bit President Trump and his administration where it counts the most: the rabid credulity of the MAGA base. Now, since Epstein's death, all manner of wild conspiracy theories have bloomed under the MAGA and QAnon communities. The Epstein scandal actually fit quite well with QAnon's core belief that there's a cabal of satanic, cannibalistic child molesters in league with the deep state, which is operating a global child sex trafficking ring. And to the extent that MAGA isn't synonymous with QAnon, conspiracy theories ran rampant in MAGA land as well, including the idea that the Clintons had murdered Epstein. Though QAnon curiously never saw the sex trafficking in their own house. Other MAGA figures like Tucker Carlson promoted the idea that Epstein was actually an intelligence asset, possibly of Israel's Mossad.
It's extremely obvious to anyone who watches that this guy had direct connections to a foreign government. Now, no one's allowed to say that that foreign government is Israel because we have been somehow cowed into thinking that that's naughty.
And that theory had some nice overlap with anti-Semitic conspiracies because Epstein and Maxwell were also ethnically Jewish. Dan Bongino, now deputy FBI director, has been promoting this conspiracy theory for years.
Which Middle Eastern countries they are, I don't know, but this person, who's a very, very good reporter, I mean, aces, right, swore Epstein was either a witting or unwitting intelligence asset, and they may have had his plane wired up, and they're the ones who have all this stuff.
And Megyn Kelly just endorsed it again on June 16th.
Do you think there's any intel community involvement in this?
I wouldn't be surprised one bit. Well, I mean, it's possible that that's the reason everything's getting buried, that there is some treasure trove, and it's getting buried because...
How many people here believe that? Raise your hand.
I mean, it's not unbelievable. I mean, it very well could be propagated by some intelligence community. It could be that Jeffrey Epstein was just doing his own thing too. I mean, we don't know, but it's not unbelievable to say that a foreign country or agencies within the U.S. know more than what they're letting on.
Okay, I'd say about half the hands think that it's being buried because of an Israeli thing.
And MAGA figures frequently promoted the idea that Epstein had a list of powerful elite men, always liberals for some reason, that had been involved in the sex trafficking, possibly so that he could blackmail them. And the kernel of truth that likely inspired this conspiracy theory was that one of Epstein's employees, Alfredo Rodriguez, did once try to sell a notebook with a list of names in it, but that notebook contained the names and contact information about Epstein's victims, not his associates. Rodriguez was later convicted of obstruction of justice and sentenced to federal prison. The contents of the Black Book was evidence in several civil lawsuits. And Rodriguez, by the way, was sentenced to the same amount of time that Epstein ended up serving as a result of Acosta's sweetheart deal. Now, President Trump has rarely encountered a conspiracy theory he didn't like. And in August of 2019, during Trump's first term, just after Epstein's death, Trump reposted a tweet suggesting that Clinton or George Soros had murdered Epstein. So when AG Pam Bondi's DOJ came out with a 2-page memo declaring that there was nothing to see, that Epstein's death was a suicide, and there was no secret client list or cabal of liberal elite sex trafficking children, the MAGAverse lost its collective mind. Dan Bongino had a spirited disagreement with Pam Bondi and threatened to possibly quit his job. Apparently, he was on the verge of making a stand. Laura Loomer warned Trump that this misstep could consume his presidency and called for a special counsel's investigation. Glenn Beck declared that he wanted Pam Bondi fired.
Okay, I want Pam Bondi fired. I want Pam Bondi fired.
Megyn Kelly called for Bondi to resign and declared that if she didn't, some MAGA bros would leave.
We're calling for Pam Bondi to resign.
The thing is like I get why people want Pam Bondi to resign or be fired. And maybe she should, but she's also she's like the face of this. And I think getting rid of her doesn't get rid of the deeper problem. She was appointed to this position to carry out the actions of whatever Trump and his administration and the people close to Trump what they want. I think getting rid of her, it's too easy. You're letting them get away with it. You're letting them use her as a scapegoat. And you fire her and go, oh, okay, well, they'll just pin it on her. It'll be like, oh, she was, you know, she was like a rogue agent. This wasn't us. This was Pam Bondi. We just realized that she was covering up all this stuff and she was lying to us and we didn't know. It was all her. And they can just pin it on her and we're back to square one.
To go. But can you please tell people the breaking news? According to reports that you have verified, Kash Patel and Dan Bongino will resign if what does not happen?
If she doesn't go.
And even House Speaker Mike Johnson said he supported the release of the Epstein Files. And it seemed that the Democrats were finally happy to find something to do. Senator Ruben Gallego accused President Trump of, quote, hiding the Epstein list. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries proclaimed that Americans, quote, deserve to know the truth. And on Tuesday, Democrats attempted to cast a procedural vote as to a referendum to compel the release of more Epstein-related material. And none of that was helped by the real questions raised by the Epstein jail cell video that the Trump administration released. As Wired has reported, nearly 3 minutes were cut out of the released video.
Which is
Bondi has
sketchy.
claimed that this is because of the way that the videos turn over at the end of the day, but Wired's experts confirmed that the video was edited. And my video editors tell me that it was a rookie move to leave that in the metadata.
Yeah, like,
and President Trump, faced with the ire of some of his supporters and insults from his enemies, went on the offensive, posting a long screed on Truth Social about how his Republican...
It just shows how incompetent these people really are. They're evil and will do what they need to and somehow figure it all out when they need to get away with all the evil shit that they do. But when it comes to going after the good guys and trying to release evidence and put it out there and prosecute them, it's all of a sudden just everything is just bullshit and incompetence. It's crazy.
And critics were just playing into the hands of the, quote, radical left Democrats, and he called his doubtful previous supporters weaklings and proclaimed that he didn't want their support anymore. And it appears that Trump and his inner circle engaged in their own real-life Epstein conspiracies. One was to stifle right-wing news from talking about the Epstein Files. Reports are that Trump and his inner circle tried to strong-arm the press from talking about Epstein, which apparently largely worked. And another is that Trump fired Maureen Comey, daughter of James Comey, who had worked at the U.S. Attorney's Office for nearly a decade and helped prosecute both Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. I mean, I don't think this really changes anything. We've got plenty of tapes where Trump talks about his friend Jeffrey Epstein and Jeffrey Epstein talks about his friend Donald Trump. But yeah, that looks pretty terrible. But then, late last night, Trump posted, quote, based on the ridiculous amount of publicity given to Jeffrey Epstein, I've asked Attorney General Pam Bondi to produce any and all pertinent grand jury testimony, subject to the court approval. This scam perpetrated by the Democrats should end right now. But the thing is, as Congressman and former federal prosecutor Daniel Goldman points out, grand jury testimony is both very specific and isn't what people were asking for and wouldn't be the most relevant documents. And in fact, he tweeted, quote, nice try, AG Pam Bondi. What about videos, photographs, and other recordings? What about FBI 302's witness interviews? What about texts and emails? That's where the evidence about Trump and others will be. Grand jury testimony will only relate to Epstein and Maxwell. And in any event, as President Donald Trump cannot order the DOJ to unilaterally release sealed grand jury testimony. In fact, the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure, Rule 6E3E, states that, quote, the court may authorize disclosure at a time, in a manner, and subject to any other conditions that it directs of a grand jury matter when, 1, preliminary to or in connection with a judicial proceeding, 2, at the request of a defendant who shows that a ground may exist to dismiss the indictment because of a matter that occurred before the grand jury, 3, at the request of the government when sought by a foreign court or prosecutor, 4, at the request of the government if it shows a matter may disclose a violation of state, Indian, tribal, or foreign criminal law, and 5, at the request of the government if it shows that the matter may disclose a violation of military criminal law. Now, President Trump wanting AG Pam Bondi to release sealed proceedings from a grand jury because of political pressure seems like it fails to meet any of those requirements. And even Trump's post recognizes that the release of these documents must be made with court approval. And I'm not going to engage in conspiracy theories, but who knows? Maybe Trump doesn't want the court to approve the disclosure. But in any event, hopefully by now you understand that the sealed grand jury proceedings are probably not the real Epstein Files to the extent they exist. But the real Epstein Files are now largely public and aren't what people think. The real Epstein Files are the thousands of pages of documents that have been generated by the criminal investigations and by civil lawsuits against Epstein and Maxwell. And some of these were unsealed in the Giuffre case, but many are still under seal. And it's likely that there are reams of witness interviews, financial statements, flight logs for Epstein's plane, records regarding his friends and acquaintances and co-conspirators, and photos and videos, including the child pornography that the Fed seized from his house. But while Megyn Kelly and Alan Dershowitz and others are calling for the unsealing of these documents, there are some very real reasons.
Imagine having to look at all that stuff. I mean, I don't know who would do it. Who's in charge of having to look at all that? I just got to be a special person to be able to view all that shit and come away unscathed, because you have to look at it to know that it's real evidence that you can then use to prosecute somebody. So you have to. It's gross, but I mean, I wouldn't want to be the one, but if everything were to be released, would that be included, that stuff? I mean, I don't think so. I mean, I don't know. It's
reasons to keep many parts of those files secret.
Just
not to protect the potential perpetrators, but to protect Epstein's hundreds of underage victims. But even if President Trump wanted to unseal these civil court documents, he can't do that unilaterally. The Department of Justice could file a motion in the relevant cases, and the judges could consider them, but because of the privacy and safety concerns, a judge might not necessarily grant the request to unseal. And if Trump were to declassify the federal criminal case files, there would also be legal implications. When the Trump administration released the JFK files, they accidentally disclosed a bunch of Social Security numbers. Any Epstein files would threaten to disclose even more private details about underage girls, potentially exposing them to yet more traumatic experiences and putting them at risk of harassment or physical violence. And there are laws, including the Privacy Act, which prohibit the government from disclosing private information about individuals without their consent. One important aspect of the Giuffre case is that Giuffre argued in favor of unsealing. She consented to it. It was an empowered choice that she made, which, when you're considering the rights of survivors, is important. So if you're looking for a real scandal in all of this, it's right there in plain sight. The real scandal is the consistent miscarriage of justice that's played out over the past 30 years. And while hundreds of victims have been identified and numerous powerful men have been implicated, only one person, Ghislaine Maxwell, has ever been convicted of sex crimes related to Epstein's decades of sexual abuse. And the sweetheart deal from one of Trump's prior cabinet secretaries may end up resulting in her escaping justice too. But all this highlights the massive gap in the justice system, which is one of the reasons I started my law firm, the Eagle Team, and one of the reasons I'm proud to fight for the little guy. Because after I started this channel, every week I'd get hundreds of comments and emails from viewers who are dealing with legal problems. People would email and ask, Devin, can you help me find a lawyer? Or how do I know if this attorney is any good? Because it's not just that legal help is expensive, though it absolutely is. It's that people don't know how to find the right lawyer for their specific situation.
It's tough.
They're scared, they're overwhelmed, and they end up either doing nothing or hiring the first attorney who calls them back. And that really bothered me. So I asked myself, what if there was a different way? What if we could build a law firm that actually lived up to the values that I talk about on this channel? Transparency, accessibility, and putting clients first instead of just chasing billable hours. A firm where you don't need to pay anything up front because your lawyers only get paid if you do, to maximize your opportunity for justice. So a few years ago, I decided to fix that problem. I decided to start my own personal injury law firm. And honestly, it wasn't an easy choice. I realized I was in a unique position. I had this platform, this community, and the experience. And that's why we started Eagle Team. Not to get rich. Trust me, there are way easier ways to make money than starting a law practice. We did it because access to justice shouldn't be a luxury. Because finding the right legal representation shouldn't feel like playing Russian roulette with your future. So when you work with my firm, you're not just getting a lawyer. You're getting a team that understands that behind every case is a real person with real stakes. And if we can't represent you, or you're in a state where we don't practice, we'll take the time to try to match you with an attorney in my personal network of lawyers. A national network of some of the best lawyers in the country who actually specialize in what you're going through, located exactly where you are, not just whoever happens to be available. So if you're dealing with a personal injury, a car crash, or a trucking accident, a data breach, sexual harassment, or a Social Security or workers' comp issue, give us a call at the number on screen or click on the link below. Look, obviously I can't represent everyone who watches this channel. I wish I could. But what I can do is make sure that when you need legal help, you'll have someone to turn to that you can trust. So whether it's me handling your case or the incredible attorneys we've partnered with, you get the same principles of honesty and education that we bring to every video. So if you're dealing with a legal issue and you're not sure where to start, check out the link in the description or call the phone number that's on screen. Let's have a conversation about how we can help you find not just any lawyer, but the right lawyer for your situation. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about. Making sure that when life gets complicated, you don't have to face it alone. Which is why if you need a lawyer, you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle Team. And after you've dropped us a line and get yourself a great lawyer, click over here to watch more Legal Eagle, or I'll see you in court.
Yeah, I mean it's fucked. It's all fucked. Um, he's right though. By the way, LegalEagle, check out their channel, check out their website. I'll link everything below in the video description. Great videos all the time. Always well done. Always a lot of important details and things that you don't hear, that are broken down. That like I said, you don't hear in the mainstream media or on social media posts. So yeah, definitely check his videos out. LegalEagle. And yeah, I mean it's frustrating. Our justice system, like he said, has major flaws, major gaps, in who it prosecutes and who it goes after, and the money and the power and the influence that's wielded within the justice system to get the results that powerful people want, whereas the little guy is just left, or the victims especially are just left with nothing, no closure, no justice. It's incredibly frustrating, and I think that's what is, the bigger issue here, with the Jeffrey Epstein, um, case. Not bigger than the victims and what they went through, but I just mean like the bigger conversation about, the files being released. Because the victims and everybody involved, they know what happened. Um, but the public needs to know what happened, and the public isn't, um, being let in on what really went down, and therefore nobody can really come to a conclusion about how to feel about this, how to feel about how it was prosecuted, and so we're all left with just no answers and nowhere to look. And we had Trump come into office saying all this and that, making all these promises, but when push came to shove, he's conveniently moved on and called his own supporters weaklings for wanting to have the files released. Um, because God forbid you're somebody that wants to get to the bottom of this and go after the people that abused these girls. Um, yeah, incredibly frustrating. Let me know what you think. We'll look more into this. We'll keep following it. But yeah, until then, we'll see how this plays out.